I'm usually on the other side watching somebody do what you're doing. With this work,
So probably just gonna put that in your pocket.
back pocket, okay.
Yeah, so it's hidden.
So it's just, and then with this, I can just talk in a natural voice, right?
You can.
I like that. I like that idea. Mm-hmm. Is that good? Is that good for you? What have you like? Yeah. Look neat anyway.
You have on a jacket or no?
No, I'm gonna go. I was going, but I'm just gonna take my jacket. It's kind of. Got it. What company is that for the laugh?
The laugh?
Yeah, yeah.
Sennheiser.
I know. There's a bit of hug on it. I forget one. I know everybody uses them. It's like, okay, I gotta get with the program.
You should really cool.
Yeah.
And this around. So it is not too noticeable.
Just keep me neat. That's all.
Yeah,
Keep me.
gotta pull this out. Down.
Is that good? Okay, good. All right. Okay. No, yep. Is there something back there already? I can move it if there is.
Yeah, you
I
can
think.
lift it so you can sit comfortably.
What's that? I think it's my wallet. I'm fine. I'm pretty good. I think I'm good. Are you okay? Is it on?
Yes, it's on.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Okay.
And you're good.
Okay. 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 Okay.
Get you ready, I'll start and hopefully we'll have them flow in.
Okay. 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 Lack of funding.
By Llewellyn Smith, documentary film producer and two-time winner of the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award. And this afternoon, I must first thank the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Kavli Foundation for sponsoring this lecture. We're going to have an opportunity to speak with him and hear about his work and his academic work and the things that he's been doing. So at this time, we're just going to go straight to it and invite him up.
Oh, sure. Why not? Thank you. Love it. I can go up this way, I guess. Yeah. Okay. All right. That was a fabulous introduction. I asked you to be brief, and you were. First, I want to say thank you all for coming. The second thing I want to say is it's an honor to be here at Howard University again. I've been here a couple times when I was much younger. Probably, about 25 years ago. I did a couple of projects here. I was very happy to work with the folks here. And I also want to thank the AAAS for supporting this lecture and inviting me to come and present. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I am just getting back from Cuba, researching a project on for the series Nova, and I actually had prepared remarks, which were not going to speak to that project. But having been in Cuba for about 7 or 8 days, 5 days of research and 2 days of filming, I'm still processing the entire experience. And so I'm going to try to introduce a little bit of that, which will help me stay focused. And it might be an interesting way to also to set up the remarks I have. Let me say a brief bit about the project, and then I want to sort of segue into the talk. So I was there with my producing partner, Kelly Thompson. And the project, I find it very fascinating. And I'll try to describe it briefly. We are looking at a Cuban vaccine that's developed by the biotech industry, which is being distributed around the world, which is made for stage 3 and stage 4 lung cancer, and appears to be fairly effective. The bioindustry in Cuba was begun by Fidel Castro. It was a personal interest of his. And so what we want to look at is not just the idea of immunology, where it comes from, what it means, and look at it through the development of this drug. So we look at the overall science, but also there's another question which I find very fascinating, which is how did a small country which has been embargoed by the United States for 55 years develop not only this area of technology expertise, but also why it hasn't been part of our understanding generally of immunotherapy. So there are two questions. So we're talking to people connected with the various technologies that we want to study, who've been very open and very welcoming. We were driving through Havana, taking pictures, doing some scouting. And as you go through Havana, if you've never been there, it's an amazing visual sort of montage of, it's like Parisian architecture blended with architecture from Madrid, blended with New Orleans architecture, and all it sort of marinated in time, but also economic trauma, also vibrant culture, just a very complex picture. And there are also these posters sometimes, and public statements by the government. And we took note of those, and we're taking note of the places we want to film when we come back and do our production work next year. And then there was one poster that really struck me, which I want to show you right now. Could you put that up for me, please? I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, it's important to see, even though it's in Spanish, it's important to see. Does anybody read Spanish? Who said yes? Can you just shout out what the translation is? It's the blockade is the greatest genocide, yes, in history. Now there are lots of, and it's interesting also that the United States and America, there's no specific reference to the U.S., but that's what it says. The blockade is the greatest genocide in history. So I took a picture, and then later on, it made me stop and think. Suppose the blockade, what they call it the blockade, that's what they're named for, basically their fundamental relationship with America is the blockade. Suppose it were true that the blockade really was the greatest genocide. In other words, and I want you to try to think about this, not so much intellectually, but just sort of try to feel this for a moment. Just try to follow me for a moment. Suppose it really is. Suppose that the exclusion of Cuba from world trade by the United States and the impact that this has had on human beings, innocent human beings, has been completely devastating across sectors. We know that the blockade has devastated every single sector. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. But here's another way to think about it. Suppose that the science and the development, the technologies, and the things that the Cuban government, the Cuban establishment have developed that have not been part of our medical establishment. Suppose that they have also, for the United States, created similar kinds of harm. In other words, is it possible that by being excluded or by excluding ourselves from conversations with scientists from other countries, in this case for Cuba, for so long, that we may have created harm to ourselves? I find that a really fascinating question, because I think that this whole question, in my mind, of science journalism, however we want to define it, if there is such a separate thing, I think that that is the kind of thing it's concerned with. If there is something that's valuable about science journalism, I'm going to try to keep up with the time. To me, it's that it is trying to ask questions about what science does and does not do, what science has access to and doesn't have access to, and why. I think that the idea of science journalism, if we have an idea, is that we are trying to ask questions that have not been asked, but questions that also have implications for larger populations, bigger populations than the people that maybe bigger populations than ourselves. In terms of asking questions, I want to start with just a couple of examples. In terms of, again, this question of what kind of harm are we creating when we're not asking certain kinds of questions? And sometimes I don't think that harm or that injustice is measurable, but I think it's there. A couple of statements. This is from the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. This is 2007. And the headline is, Gender Bias in Research, How Does It Affect Evidence-Based Medicine? The evidence basis of medicine may be fundamentally flawed because there is an ongoing failure of research tools to include sex differences in design and analysis. For example, this is the example they use. For example, research funding for coronary artery disease in men is far greater than for women, yet the same at-risk population of women, which is an older group, suffers morbidity and mortality. The lack of funding for women's disease, in effect, maintains women's lower economic status. And then it goes on to talk about how this kind of research becomes even more complex, because when you start to ask some scientists who are doing research in this area why they're excluding women, their answer is, well, we want to develop the research that we've already done in the past, which is also excluding women. So this is an interesting, we don't know what harm is happening here, but we also know that there's something that may be askew in terms of the research and the things that come out of that can affect all of us. For example, women may have a different drug efficacy or side effect profile from men. That's also been pointed out in the research. Here's another piece that I thought was very interesting, again, around biases and again, thinking about what kind of reporting, what kind of thinking about science might intervene here. And I think it's something, in many cases, these articles are an intervention. This is from, I think, PLOS Medicine. Why are health studies so white? This is 2016, June 2016. And this article really talks about the lack of African American and people of color in trials for various medicines and various treatments. And one of the respondents is saying that the reason that African Americans are not in these trials is because they have a whole history going back to the syphilis testing, the Tuskegee Project, that they don't trust medicine, they don't trust researchers. But it turns out the research shows that that's really not true, that African Americans really are willing to participate in these trials. And so what you begin to get is the implication that actually researchers are just as biased as a lot of us. They're in the habit of bringing in people that they know, which in this case is largely white. And they don't do, as someone says, actually the author comes out right here and says, we're not saying there's no such thing as distrust, but I think many investigators may not be taking the time to identify potential community partners for reaching out. And you can go on. The other article I was going to refer to has to do with asthma, and talks about the lack of African Americans and people of color in asthma research. And this research they're talking about is from the NIH. I'm sorry, from the NIH. So this goes on. There's another article. I mean, these articles go on, and what I'm sort of getting at is that this is not a matter of simply a science problem. This is a matter of justice. It's a matter of social justice. We're talking about communities who are being harmed or endangered primarily because of the lack of concern for communities of color or communities of women which are outside of the general mainstream within the science world, which tends to be largely white men. So to me, this is a good setup for the first clip that I want to show and talk about for a moment. In about 2006, I was invited to work on a series called Unnatural Causes is Inequality Making Us Sick. And I don't know if anybody's seen that, but it's a 7-part series that was on there for PBS. And what we were trying to look at was what was being described, and I think it's still being described as the social determinants of health. And the concept, the social determinants of health has been in the literature and has been discussed in the science for probably over 100 years. And I think that term is actually the term that's been used. But this is one of those situations where it's something that has never been communicated in a way for the public. Scientists don't talk to the public very well. I'm not a scientist, by the way, so I think that's one of my strengths in terms of this work. You laugh, but I think that's good. I laugh too. I'm wondering, why am I doing this? But I'm not a scientist. I don't have a science background. But as I was saying this afternoon to some of the film students, I think I can make my ignorance work for me, because if someone is trying to describe a complex process and I don't understand it, I can't communicate it. And I also can think about what it is that stops me from understanding it and work with that so that my audience can understand it. So the social determinants of health was a tricky concept for me to understand, because the fundamental idea is that, I mean, if you want to boil it down, I think in a very short way, if you talk to most epidemiologists and you tell them what your zip code is, they can tell you what your risk for heart disease is, your risk for diabetes is, your risk for all kinds of problems are, and they can tell you how long you can expect to live. And the point is, that's unnatural. That should not be the case. But almost any epidemiologist in this country will tell you that it is the case. And so we're trying to look at in the series why that is. And so there's 7 parts of this. It's actually a pretty complex series, I think very, very well told. It's still being taught in many different public health schools. The clip I want to show is a short clip from a section called When the Bow Breaks. And this is looking at pregnancies in African American women and the sort of challenges that they have bringing a child, statistically bringing a child to term prematurely. I'm trying to think of this. Anyway, I should probably just show you the clip. But what interests me about what I want to show this clip is that, as I was saying this afternoon, the idea that race could, or racism, I shouldn't say racism could be a public health issue. That you could have other kinds of ways of thinking about public health that might include race scientifically, was just beginning to come on the scene. And I think now researchers are actually publishing more and more material to sort of describe this. I think this clip comes in sort of as these researchers are beginning to talk about, statistically, are trying to understand why it is that African American women as a group, how do you begin to understand why there's this problem in terms of how they compare to other women in the United States. So this is a short clip. Let's take a look at this.
Education, for example, predicts infant mortality for both black women and white women. And the more educated you are, the less likely you are to have a low birth weight baby, a preterm baby, or an infant death.
Women who are poorest and least educated are those whose babies are at greatest risk in any racial group. But the babies of African American mothers with higher education are still at greater risk than we'd expect. Infant mortality among white American women with a college degree or higher is about 4 deaths per 1,000 births. But among African American women with the same level of education, infant mortality is about 10 per 1,000 births, almost 3 times higher. In fact, African American mothers with a college degree have worse birth outcomes than white mothers without a high school education.
Think about this. We're talking about African American doctors, lawyers, and business executives, and they still have a higher infant mortality rate than non-Hispanic white women who never went to high school in the first place. As a mother, you're thinking, I did all the right things. They told me to take vitamins, I took vitamins. They told me to walk, they told me to eat vegetables, they told me not to drink, I didn't do all that. And why is my kid sitting there with these needles? And, so you feel real helpless. You really feel helpless.
So Doctors Collins and David asked themselves if the answer could possibly be genetic. It's well known that prematurity can run in families. Is there something in the DNA of African American women that tends toward premature births regardless of education, prenatal care, or lifestyle? To answer the question, they created a study based on a simple assumption.
If there was such a thing as a prematurity gene and it came from Africa, then Africans should have more of it.
They compared newborns among 3 groups: African American women, African immigrants to the U.S., and U.S.-born white women.
It turns out that the Africans and the whites were about the same. The African Americans, on the other hand, had babies that weighed almost 8 or 9 ounces less than the other 2 groups.
In other words, African immigrants to the U.S. and white women born in the U.S. had similar pregnancy outcomes. So if there is any genetic predisposition for low birth weight babies, it's doubtful that it falls along what we call racial lines.
Yeah, she hadn't had any drop in her heart rate with those diseases.
It turns out that when African women immigrate to the U.S., it takes only 1 generation before their daughters are at risk of having premature babies at a significantly higher rate and with poorer birth outcomes.
Has her heart rate been in that range, over 180?
No, actually, it's been about 160.
So that one generation, women with African descent are doing poorly. This, to us, it really suggests that something is driving this that's related to the social milieu that African American women live in throughout their entire life.
Okay. So, I mean, that's the end of the clip. So again, I think that there's one of the values of what we're calling science journalism is that it can begin to ask different kinds of questions that are not necessarily mainstream questions. I think that, I think we depend on scientists and researchers and institutions to guard the quality of life that we have. We assume that that's going to happen, and I think when that doesn't happen, mostly, it doesn't mean that people are insincere in their vision and their efforts. But just because we're talking about trusted researchers and trusted institutions, it doesn't mean, in some cases, these institutions are supported by our own tax dollars. It doesn't mean that they may be asking the right kinds of questions, or that they're peopled with folks who are sensitive to asking those kinds of questions that we want to have asked. And I'm reminded of Harvard epidemiologist Nancy Krieger, who actually opens this series. And she makes a very simple statement. She says, basically, we're all going to die. We all get that. That's the price of the ticket being here. But the question is, with what degree of preventable suffering? And that's really what we're talking about. And where science is not engaged properly in asking the right questions, then we're talking about very likely degrees of preventable suffering in populations that should not happen. So I think it's quite interesting that now we're at a place where you have scientists having to reckon with research that makes it clear that racism, the impact of racial dynamics, so difficult interactions. I blank on the word, the term, because I hate the term. But these sort of daily interventions and these other kinds of things, as a number of psychotherapists, including my wife, like to say, and it's a famous quote, and I can't think of the therapist who says this, but he says, "The body keeps score." We think some of these events that happen in our head are just things we need to talk about. The body keeps score. The body absorbs these things. The body knows what you're struggling with. And so you begin to look and understand. You're talking about hypertension. You're talking about diseases of the heart, other kinds of effects, and these are measurable. And I think that that's going to be an interesting challenge as we go on for science to have, and medicine and public health to have to sort of reckon with the reality that what people have been saying about the trauma of living in this country day to day if you're a person of color may actually be something they have to, do much more with in their work. The other thing so the next thing I wanted to talk about is a film that I did with Nova not too long ago. Actually, that was a while ago. When was Percy Julian? 2007? Oh my gosh, okay. In 2000, not too long ago, 2007, in dog years. And this came out, and this film, I think, is another example, I think, of a kind of science journalism piece, which is really a profile that was meant to talk about not just the achievements of an African-American chemist, but to try to look at his life in science. That was a series, I think it was called Life in Science. It was a series, a grant for Life in Science series that we did with Nova. And we were trying to talk about not only Percy Julian's science, but also give a sense of what it meant for him to be a human being, an ordinary man, dealing with the things that he had to do with. Because I think sometimes we think about, I think that sometimes we don't have the full picture of what it means to be that scientist is like the rest of us. And that if you're a person of color, you deal with those issues that everybody else has to deal with. Many people, I didn't know, I have to say, who Percy Julian was when I started the project. And does anybody else know that name? So you're with me, so you didn't know either. I mean, Percy Julian was an African-American scientist who, in his career, became quite well known among other scientists, other chemists, for the work he did at the Glidden paint factory, which sounds kind of like backwards. But even with a man of his understanding and his training, he had trained in Europe with some of the top chemists in the world, he was unable to get the work he wanted to get in terms of research. There was nobody in the 30s and 40s who wanted to work with an African-American man. So he wound up being hired as a production chemist for Glidden Paint. And there he essentially wound up making Glidden Paint, creating a whole other separate industry within Glidden Paint, which was the synthesis of human steroids from soy products. He was the first person to synthesize progesterone from soy products and testosterone, a number of other feeds. And basically his work in terms of establishing showing how you could actually take elements from nature, synthesize them, and then scale up production, made many, many, many products available to people. And in fact, this is actually from Wikipedia. We know they tell the truth. But basically, they're saying he's responsible for making the availability of birth control pills, corticosteroids, steroids, and all these things available to people. So we don't even know who this guy is. And one of the things that happened for me, actually, when I was shooting this, I remember that we were filming with Ruben Santiago Hudson, who plays Percy Julian in our reenactments in the film. Terrific actor who's done a lot of television work and he's on Broadway. And someone walked up and asked us in Baltimore what we were doing. Percy Julian he loved flowers. He loved tulips specifically. So we actually were filming tulips. Our actor was out there, we were filming him working in tulips. And this guy comes up and he says, you know, what are you doing? We say, we're doing this film about Percy Julian, explained it. He said, you don't have to tell me who this guy is. And it turned out this guy himself was a chemist. And he said, and he was retired. He said, I was a chemist, I was a pretty good chemist. And then he says, but I wasn't a chemist like Percy Julian. I mean, it was like this guy was very well known within the world of science. In fact, he comes to a science conference on synthesizing steroids. He had just been the first person to synthesize progesterone in the country, I think in the world. So they're having a conference on synthesizing steroids. All the scientists are white. He can't get in. And basically, they threatened to shut down the whole conference till this guy gets in. So it's one of these people who is well known at certain levels within his own world of science after a point. But we still don't know who this, you know, despite the fact he has a stamp in his honor, we still don't know who this guy is. We also don't appreciate, I think, fully, not knowing him. We don't know what he went through, that he had seen a lynched man in his youth. He lived in a place where he could walk. He actually walked in the woods and saw a man who had been lynched. That when he went to college, he had to stay basically in essentially a broom closet and just work for other people. I mean, he had sort of insult after insult after insult. And they continued even after he became fairly well known and established at the Glidden Company. So this clip is really about his family coming to Chicago, I am blanking on the city. No, the park where he lived, his house. Oak Park. His family coming to Oak Park and buying a very large house and preparing to move in. And it's really the story of what happens when Percy Julian, well known now, he's in advertisements for cigarettes and this and that, moves into Oak Park and is ready to reestablish himself. So let's just roll that.
The Julians moved in, and when a few months passed with no further trouble, Percy and Anna felt confident enough to go out of town, leaving the children with a babysitter.
First my parents saw of it was when they saw it in the paper the next day with me pointing to the hole in the ground.
Hey, but Daddy, I hear that there's,
I'll never forget the morning that my daughter, Sandra, said, Daddy, they bombed my friend Percy Julian's house last night. And then she said, Daddy, why did they do that? Why would they bomb their house?
And some fire came out of it and got on fire.
I put on a record because I didn't have the answer.
My dad was angry when he came home. I mean, really angry and clearly ready to fight. He looked at this as an attempt to murder his kids. For him, there was nothing redeemable about them at all. I'm taking this in like there's no tomorrow. And actually, everything has a good side. The good side was, as a kid, I got to spend more time with my dad and got to stay up late because we'd sit in the tree outside. He'd sit there with a shotgun and we'd talk about why someone would want to do this and how wrong it was and how stupid it was.
I was hoping that last bit would stay up longer. That's actually a letter that was written to him. There was a threatening letter. He continued to be threatened after he moved to Oak Park. And actually, that was the second attempt to firebomb his house. And I like that clip because if you see Forgotten Genius, the film, which is about 90 minutes long, there's a great deal about his science and about the challenges he went through. And I think that from the stories that I've heard from people who knew him, that this this impacted him so deeply that he wound up being a political, working politically and openly for affordable housing and fair housing and equal housing in Chicago. So I think that I think when we're talking about science, and we're talking about scientists, and we're talking about sort of science journalism, I think there are other kinds of questions that we can ask, as, for example, in this case, what is the life of an African American? What was the life of an African American scientist like, trying to make his way in a world that, in many cases, sometimes wanted him, sometimes didn't want him. And the last part of this I will say before I move on to the next clip is, I don't know if I told you this actually, Melanie, but at the end of, when we finished the Percy Julian film, you probably haven't seen the film. If you don't know, you probably haven't seen the film, but you should watch it. It's a good film. At the end of the production, what we do in the process is we show some of the people who worked on the film bits and clips so we can get a feedback from them. And there was one gentleman who was a very important science advisor on the film, and I remember that the last note of the film is really, I think, a very important note. It's, again, one of those questions that doesn't get asked very often. We recount all of the things that he accomplished. I mean, he had an extraordinary life in science. We are still benefiting from the things he accomplished as a scientist, the things that had never been done before, but especially making all of these drugs that we know are helpful, figuring out ways to synthesize them and scale them up so that they could be available. That was probably one of his biggest accomplishments, and we're still thriving on that. But the last beat of the film, after all these accomplishments, is saying, but what if he'd actually had the opportunity that other scientists would have had to do the research that he wanted to do? This guy, without question, a world-class thinker. And this particular gentleman was really upset with that ending. I mean, he really was upset that we wanted to end the film that way, because his feeling was, let's continue to celebrate his life and celebrate the accomplishments. And it's like, no, you actually have to hold them both. You actually have to hold them both. And I think that's something that we, in terms of thinking about science and even thinking about storytelling, we have a hard time doing. We want things to be very simple. Give me a nice ending, give me the ending I can follow. No, you need to. And in terms of science, it's important to think the same way. We have to hold both things. The desire that I think most scientists, particularly in the public health sector, and that's mainly what I'm talking about, is people who are connected with public health, the things that they want to accomplish versus the things that they may be failing at and not know, the questions that they're not asking that we need to continue to ask, that they're not prepared to ask, or they, for whatever reason. And I think that's so I'm not trying to offer any sort of random sort of condemnation, but we do have a difficulty, I think, holding on to complexity. This gentleman certainly did. So as I said, I'm not a scientist. I play one in the field when I'm in production, but I am a storyteller. I am interested in stories. And as I was saying to students this afternoon, I try to be aware of what I'm not aware of, and I try to use that to help me think about how do I communicate these things to people who may not be aware of these things. What is it about a presentation on science or an investigation that excites me, and I'm going to assume that it may excite other people? What's the hook that gets me? I'm thinking that's going to get other people hooked on the thought or the idea. When I was asked to do the film about the Flint water crisis, I think that one of the most striking things about that episode was the sense that the people who were the scientists that I was mentioning before, who we were depending on, or people would depend on for their safety and for the safety of their water and the safety of their children, had failed them so horrifically that some of them are actually being charged right now with manslaughter. With it's not manslaughter. What is manslaughter? I can't tell you. It's what is the term? It is involuntary manslaughter. I'm sorry, I want to write that down. That's pretty extreme for a public health official. So when we went into this film, I think our job was, though the water crisis had already begun to play out completely, I think our job was to find a way to talk about it in terms of not just the science of what happened, but also the failure of the scientists who were tasked with looking after and taking care of the water situation in Flint. And as we got more and more into the story, it became clear that you really couldn't talk about one without the other. And I think that was one of the things that made it an unusual film for the Nova series, because it's difficult to talk about the science of the water crisis without getting into the politics as well. So I want to show this short clip, and then I'm going to stop for questions. But this short clip is from Poison Water. And at this point in the story, the independent investigators who come in to show that there's a water problem in Flint and to explain why there's a water problem in Flint have been, I would use the term, smacked down again by the establishment. There's a complete continual denial of any real independent research that's being done. And so this sort of becomes the last straw that begins to crack open the awareness, and where people begin to finally see there's no denying this anymore. It can't be hidden. So maybe we can play this clip, please.
That night was the first night that I stopped sleeping, because anybody who knows anything about lead stops sleeping. And that really kind of started my almost crusade to find out if that lead in the water was getting into the bodies of our children. This is not something you mess around with. We are never, ever, ever supposed to expose a child to lead, because once a child has it in their blood, there is not much that you can do about it.
Dr. Hannah Atisha begins a systematic study of the amounts of lead in children's blood.
How old are you? You are doing real good. What we did is we compared lead levels before the water switched in 2013, and we compared them to lead levels after the water switch in 2015. Really only looking at one thing, was the percentage of children with lead levels at or above 5 micrograms per deciliter. When we saw the results, we weren't surprised, but we were heartbroken. How could this have happened? We saw that the percentage of children with elevated lead levels, this 5 or greater, had doubled after the water switch. And in some neighborhoods where the water lead levels done by Mark Edwards were the highest, were the same neighborhoods that the children's blood lead levels had increased the most. But right away, the state's machinery began to dismiss me. They began to dismiss the research, and that the state's numbers didn't add up to my numbers. They said it was causing near hysteria. They shouldn't have been surprised, because for 18 months, the people of Flint were dismissed, and the moms were dismissed, and the activists were dismissed, and the pastors, and the journalists, and the EPA scientists were dismissed.
I think that the only thing I would add to that is I think that what's curious about the Flint, there are two things. One is that, I was talking with someone just a moment ago about what was happening in Flint, and that's that the problem, I think, largely now is fairly psychological. After that kind of trauma in a community, it's like, I don't even know, again, how do you even measure the level, the consequences of mistrust? I've talked to people there, when scientists had actually said that the water was safe to drink, who said they would never drink this water, who would continue to use bottled water, which actually is a health problem. Most people don't realize that that's actually, there are lots of problems with just only using bottled water. But, and the other thought is actually, and I've been talking about this today, you actually, Melanie actually sent me an email about what was going on in Newark. Is it Newark? Yeah. Almost the same exact thing. I mean, the exact thing. Problems with the pipe infrastructure, people who are responsible for the water lying about the amount of lead in the water, and lying until somebody comes in with an independent research investigation to show actually no, the people are really at risk. And as we said at the end of this film, this is going to be repeated again and again and again in the United States because our water infrastructure is so decrepit, because it hasn't been cared for, and the cost to do that is so immense. So I think that's, again, a part of, I don't know, the work of thinking about science and justice is going back to this thought, which sticks with me, which is, we all die, but at what level of unnecessary risk, and unnecessary harm or unnecessary risk. And whatever we can do to challenge the things that create more harm or suffering than we should have, those are the things that this kind of work, thinking about science, should be trying to pursue. So I would like to stop there, and I'm much more interested in questions if there are questions. Oh, that's very kind. Oh, thank you.
I have one.
Sure, please.
I have one. Getting started on a project.
I'm sorry?
What gets you started on a project? What ignites your interest to start a project?
I think it's the story. I mean, I don't know how to say it any better. I think that in the several films that I've done with Nova, they've always been a powerful story that ties science with the storytelling. I mean, as I said at lunch today, I'm not a scientist, and it's not that I'm not interested in science, but there are certain kinds of science stories that I don't engage me as a producer. I mean, if you want to talk about the T-Rex and how big they are and blah, blah, I'll watch that, but that's not my thing. The only stories that get my attention, it's sort of, there are real consequences that expand even beyond the characters, and the implications are implications for all of us to be concerned about. Those are which are, again, that's another way I think of thinking about social justice stories, but those are the stories that I'm interested in telling. The science is important, and the science is even central, but it's also a vehicle for other kinds of questions that we need to ask. So those are the stories that always attract me. My background is history, so if there are dimensions of American history, then that gets me even jazzed, more jazzed. I happen to think history is badly taught and badly understood in this country, but that's a whole separate other conversation.
Anybody else? Well, I can't thank you enough.
Oh, no, wait, there's more. To Flint High School College? No, I went to Flint, Michigan. You were living there? No, there's a program there called Alternative Spring Break. Okay, oh, you went there 2 years ago? For 2 years. Okay. 2 years in a row. So my freshman year, I'm a senior now. My freshman year, my sophomore year, I was as a student journalist. Okay. So I took testimony via audio about what was going on in the community from various levels, being, the students at the schools, the teachers, to like the lunch ladies, the custodians, and parents. Great. Were on this film, and I saw the rashes on their bodies, and I'll never forget that image for the rest of my life. So I'm just curious, how did going to that city, and also going to different communities around the nation to uncover injustice as it exists within our environment, how has that affected you personally? Can I ask you a question before I answer my question? How did it affect you to be there? It's very, it is not abstract to be in those places and talk to people like that. In this film, it's interesting. I mean, I'll talk about myself, and I'll talk about this particular note on something that's actually not in the film. I think that the more you talk to people, I think the more affecting and disturbing it is. And I think, as I said, the thing that sort of struck me and left me sort of, and when I was in Flint, I kept talking, is the level of trauma. I mean, there's only one word for it, it's trauma. And there's a kind of hurt that, you know, which was was hard for me to stay with, because it's sort of like a hurt that you can't find a way to heal, because there's a level of hurt that we just can't, there's no way to, in my impression, there's no way of fixing it. And it was just, I found it hard. I had to sort of step back a number of times. There's a sequence in the film where we talk about the students. Mark Edwards, who's at Virginia Tech, brings a number of students into Flint to do the work to do actual research, and with the people there to do independent work to show that the water actually is dangerous to drink. And I met a number of those students, and it was really interesting to talk about them, and they were very enthusiastic about what they did. But a number of them said that it was so traumatic they couldn't go back. So it's not easy sometimes, you know, in terms of being in that space, and really, if you spend time with people and let them, I mean, you can't not be there and not feel something. You can't just sort of take pictures. It doesn't work that way. I can't hear you. Don't be sorry. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. By the time we got there, there were so many cameras, and people were sort of sick of cameras. I mean, think about it. I mean, you're trying to figure, as Leanne Walters says at the end of the film, she says, if you think this is hard, if you think this is not so hard, turn off your water for a week and see what happens to you in your life. Just turn it off for a week. And people are reporting, I mean, there are people from other countries who are reporting. I mean, so by the time, there are cases where we would come in to do an interview, and there's a camera person set up in a corner, or literally in one case, we came to do somebody's interview, and the camera crew is just leaving. I mean, it's just like they're sort of sick of it. But I have to say that I think that one of the things we had in our favor is that they knew we were going to keep coming back, and we kept coming back, and we were trying to do something bigger. I'm not saying that all the reporting was very superficial. I am not saying that, but that was why we were there, to do a larger picture. And I think that it's not that we discovered anything new. I don't think we discovered anything new, but I don't think anybody had put together a whole picture of just sort of what actually happened, and where did the failures, where did the institutions that were supposed to be responsible for these things break down, and what did they do? And I think that trying to tell that complete story, and there are lots of things left out. There's one more piece I want to add. I'm glad you asked that question. Trying to tell that story, I think, and trying to make that story available to people, I think, and knowing that we were trying to do that, I think gave us a certain bit of credibility that I think some people didn't have. And so they were pretty welcoming. I think the thing we left out of the film, and that's left out of that story, and there's no way we could have gotten in, is that, and most people don't realize this, but it's very, very important. Unfortunately, we couldn't bring it into the film, and that is that if you look at the research, if you look at the historians, there are two really good books out about Flint now, and if you look at the civil rights, the Michigan Civil Rights Investigator did a report on Flint. They all say, they say numbers, but the one thing they say, all said the same thing in this one case, which is that the water crisis is really, it's to understand really what that meant, you have to go all the way back in history to when the economic situation in Flint broke down. And what they basically say is that the water crisis is a result of neglect, institutional harm, institutional racism, and all kinds of things that undermined Flint for decades and allowed the state to come in and do the kind of things they do, because by the time that the water crisis comes in, the state is basically dismantling Flint's economy, literally. They have brought in state managers, and their job is basically to find the resources to pay off the debt, and they really don't give a damn where they come from. So what they were planning to do was basically set up a separate water source for Flint, basically to make money to pay off creditors. I mean, the idea of setting up the source makes sense, the things they're trying to do, but I'm just saying that's one part of this sort of story. In other words, the people in Flint had been struggling with a lot of this stuff up to this point, and these writers will say essentially that the water crisis is just the ultimate outcome, where you basically have managers coming in who are not really concerned with the public well-being, not really that knowledgeable in some cases about the water infrastructure, making decisions which are essentially about paying off debt. And so that's a story we couldn't get into, but as I said, I wish I could think of the two books, but there's one that's really, really very good that sort of takes us in this perspective. And you can begin to realize, you will begin to realize that there are a lot of other cities who are facing similar crises, or going to be, or are in sort of similar crises, where you've got economics that undermining people's lives, and that makes people politically and economically helpless, and then, here come the people to take it apart. So, yeah. Yeah, well, this issue came up. That was one. First of all, we had a pretty good response from people in Flint, and there are two things that came up in the question and answer session. Because I was there, Paul was there. There were a number of people there who were in the film. The first thing was that a lot of people wanted to make it understood that the water crisis for them was not over. That even when scientists were saying that the water is drinkable and usable with a filter, that they were saying no, that they were still having problems, that they did not believe that. And so that was one thing. And that gets into a whole area which that I sort of struggle with, because does that mean the water is safe? What does it actually mean? Is that a physical response? Is it a traumatic response? Is there something still going with the water? Some people have these problems, some people don't. What is that? But clearly there are people who are still struggling with the water, even though people are saying it's safe. What does that mean? I don't know. I'm not denying their struggle. I just don't know what that means. And people are making it clear, no, this is not done. This is not safe. We don't trust it. And clearly there's also a lot of mistrust of the institutions there. The second thing that came up that I remember is the thing I just brought up, which is people saying that you've got to understand, or one person in particular saying, you've got to understand that there's a history that takes us to this point. And if you don't understand the history, you really don't understand the politics that created this moment where, now we're looking at a completely destroyed water structure done by people who essentially had come here to take the city apart to pay off debt. So, I'm happy to take other questions on that unhappy note. But other questions? I love your cues. I don't, actually she's not in this clip, I'm sorry. Leanne Walters is, gosh, I should have a Leanne Walters clip, but Leanne Walters is sort of this amazing woman who, her son was lead poisoned by the water in Flint. And she is the person, and other scientists who come to Flint, especially Mark Edwards, make the point, and I love the way he makes the point. He says, basically, we didn't discover the problem of what was happening in Flint. it was Leanne Walters who figured out what the problem was. We came in with the science to just underscore the reality of what she found. Basically, the short story is that Leanne Walters is living in Flint, and her kids are having rashes and all kinds of problems, and she's trying to get help from people who are basically denying her support, saying this is not happening, it's not our issue, she can't get any support. And she eventually reaches out to someone at the EPA who, anyway, she reaches out to someone who's able to test the water. It turns out there's a huge amount of lead in the water, and she's trying to figure what's going on. And she does the research to figure out that the city does not have corrosion control in place. And the way that corrosion control works, and this is probably the most important science we do really in the film, when you have a population of over 100,000 people, you have to have a corrosion control plan, especially if you're changing water sources, and that's what they were doing. They were moving water. They were going to build a new source for the water from Huron, but to do that, they actually had to move the water source to the Flint River first, which was very polluted. The problem wasn't that the Flint River was polluted. They had no corrosion control plan. And what that means is you have a plan so that the interior of the pipes is kept safe, because as water flows through the pipes, it develops a kind of, I don't know what you call it, but sort of interior sort of protection, because if you run water directly through pipes, it has no, I don't know what you call this. There's a chemical name, but it's a sort of a film, actually. A film is a good word. Film that develops in the pipes. If you're running water directly through the pipes, it's going to pull into the water, whatever that is, if it's copper, if it's whatever. So you've got to have a plan to protect that film. That's corrosion control. Well, these guys had no plan. So what basically happened is when they went to the Flint River, that water went straight into the pipes. It ripped off that protection. And then lead and other things began to come into the water. Well, Leanne Walters was the person who kept investigating, kept asking for documents, and finally found the document that showed that they had no corrosion control. And in the film, you'll see there's several people who say when they saw that document, they were just like, they flipped out. People who understood what that meant, just like they lost their mind, because you don't do that in a city. That's essentially, and I don't know how they got there, but that's essentially the same problem in Newark. Yeah, there's no, yeah. So whoever it is, the mayor is trying to he's saying there's nothing wrong with the water, and now the scientists come in and say, no, yes, there is. And they say, oh, but I didn't say you said the water, you didn't mention the pipes. I mean, it's crazy. It's like, are you insane? So, but Leanne Walters was the person who figured this out. And when she connected with other scientists like Mark Edwards, they were the ones who came in who said, well, this sounds insane, and we've tested your water's off the charts for lead, so let's go in and do another piece of research. And as Leanne Walters talks about in the film, it was a remarkable piece of research because it required that the community do the measuring. And the measuring to test water is very complicated. You have to do certain jugs at certain times, certain amounts, at certain hours. It's all got to be labeled. It's going to get sent out. And so they had 250 people basically 200 people helping them do this. And so it's an example of really, ordinary people getting into the science of protecting themselves. And the result of that work really showed without question that there was a hazard in the water. And of course, the state responded and said, that's nonsense, you didn't do the research. And this goes on and on and on until this moment when Dr. Hanatisha does this lead study, and it becomes clear that the children are being injured by this, or children are potentially being injured by the water. And that's when things really flip drastically the other way, when the state has to finally back up and acknowledge that there's a problem. And those lawsuits are still going on,
So I just want to say that one of the strengths of your skills as a director is that you are so well able to combine the personal story of Leanne, a community activist, with the scientists and keep both of those threads going and interweaving and going back and forth. And I just want to compliment.
Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you. I never heard that from you. But I think that in terms of science, the kind of science storytelling I like, that's the challenge. I mean, it's not, it's showing, it's doing both. Yeah, keeping the science line going, but also making it clear that it's almost like you can't tell, if you can come up with a structure where you feel like you can't talk about one without the other, then you're really there. You know you're there. You can't talk about the science without the people. You can't talk about the people without the science. Then that's when you nail it. So that's good. Yeah. Sir, yeah.
I'm a Llewellyn with AAAS, and I just wanted to thank you for doing this, and I think we can probably wrap it up.
Okay, I'm happy to. Thank you very much for coming, all of you who did. Thank you. You lived where? What?